Bitcoin's had a tremendous move in a relatively short period of time. And if you're a long-term holder and a long-term investor in it, truly the best thing you can hope for is that Bitcoin trades sideways like it's doing.
It's Thursday, August 1st, and this is Markets Daily, hosted by me, Jen Sanasi. On this show, we navigate the currents shaping the crypto markets, providing insights against the broader financial landscape. So, whether you're actively trading or simply just fascinated by the volatility of crypto markets, this show is your compass to understanding what's happened, where we are, and where we're going. Good morning, everyone. On today's show, I'm very excited to be joined by eToro US investment and options analyst, Bret Kenwell. Hey, Bret.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here. Now, I just got to start off very broadly. If we take a look at what's going on in the markets this morning, everything is in the red, but things are just kind of not very exciting lately. What are you watching?
Yeah, big picture, it's hard not to still be thinking about the Fed and some of Chairman Powell's commentary yesterday. As expected, the Fed kept rates unchanged. I think had they cut rates unexpectedly yesterday, that may have startled investors, but they kept the rates steady, and Jerome Powell did exactly what investors were hoping for, which was laid out a roadmap to get the rate cut in September. So he did that. We have the Fed's sort of ideal scenario to getting there, and yeah, I think markets were reacting accordingly.
After the Fed meeting yesterday, I've read a bunch that there's little indication that a September rate cut is guaranteed. Talk to me a little bit more about what you're expecting to see. Do you think that rate cut is going to come in September, and what does that mean for crypto markets?
I do think we get a rate cut in September. I wouldn't say it's a guarantee necessarily, but I would say that the market is now fully pricing in a rate cut, and if we do not get it, we will see that sort of repercussion in the markets, and I don't think it would be a good repercussion. Investors want rate cuts, whether that's in the equities market or the crypto market, and you know, Jerome Powell laid out the scenario that basically said as long as we continue to the inflation data, the labor data roughly in line with what we've been seeing lately and what is in line with economists' expectations going forward, that should be enough to get, for the Fed to have enough confidence in cutting rates. And, you know, we've seen equity markets sort of rally in anticipation of rate cuts. Granted, that rate cut target has been sort of moving this year, but it's also a positive for crypto markets, in my opinion. Lower rates increases liquidity, and increased liquidity is a good thing for crypto. So, hopefully we see some, Bitcoin's been kind of consolidating here for a while. It's been just sort of trading sideways for a few months. Hopefully, between that and a few other catalysts, we see enough to lift it higher.
I know you just said that you are expecting a rate cut in September, but is there a chance we don't get a rate cut at all this year? And what do you see happening in the markets if that happens, if we get to September and there's still nothing?
That's an interesting scenario. So yes, there is a potential that we don't get the cut in September, and technically there's a potential we don't get any cuts this year. Go back, to the beginning of the year, or I guess the end of 2023, and investors and markets were pricing in upwards of 5 to 6 rate cuts from the Fed this year, starting in March, and you know that scenario didn't play out, even close to being what reality ended up being, and so we've seen sort of this moving targets and these shifts in expectations when it comes to rate cuts. But I would just say that, in the short term, if that were to be the case, so the way we don't get to a rate cut, by the way, is, we see a jump in inflation, or that's the most likely way, or really, really strong employment numbers. But, outside of that, it's most likely the Fed will cut rates in September. But, it's not, rates matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. I mentioned just a minute ago that expectations coming into this year were pretty high for rate cuts, and we didn't get them. And yet the markets have continued to storm higher. And the story behind Bitcoin and crypto has sort of gotten quiet lately as the price has been going sideways. But investors have to remember that it has also done quite well this year. So I would say rate cuts matter, but they are certainly not the only thing that matters.
Let's talk about those prices. I took a look at a chart this morning. I sent it over to you. The Bollinger Bandwidth Indicator that successfully predicted the late 2023 volatility is glowing again. So it's declined to 20% on the weekly chart. And this is a level that was last seen days before Bitcoin exited a multi-month trading range between 25K and 32K. I think we even saw Bitcoin hit new levels months after this last happened. What are you reading here? What are you expecting to see happen with Bitcoin, whether it's related to this or not?
Yeah, this type of contraction and volatility and this type of consolidation is really a good thing. A lot of investors probably view it as boring. Maybe some are getting frustrated with the lack of traction that Bitcoin's had on the upside. All these sort of false breakouts, these false hopes. Every time it looks like it's ready to go and run to new highs, it stalls out and pulls back. But I think investors need to remember the bigger picture. Bitcoin basically doubled from its January low to its March high. It doubled in price in 2 months from the fourth quarter low or the third quarter low. I think it was September maybe last year. The asset almost tripled in price. So Bitcoin's had a tremendous move in a relatively short period of time. And if you're a long-term holder and a long-term investor in it, that truly the best thing you can hope for is that Bitcoin trades sideways like it's doing for several months. And whether that ends up being in September where it finally gets that traction, or it's, later in the fourth quarter, maybe even next year. Unfortunately, I don't have my crystal ball on when it could happen, but, as someone who observes the technicals and watches the charts, I think it's great to see it trading sideways like this.
Now, if you were going to look at assets to allocate a portfolio this morning, are there any particular ones that you'd highlight?
Well, going back to equities a bit, small caps just came off a really powerful month. They've been kind of asleep all year long. Investors have been waiting for this group to come to life, and in July they really did. The Russell 2000, which is a measure of U.S. small cap companies, rallied 10.1% in July. A very, very powerful month. And we went through the data last night, going back to 1979. There's been 22 occasions where the Russell rallied more than 10% in a month, and this one being the most recent. So 90% of the other measurable instances, the Russell rallied 90% of the time 6 months later. So small caps are a place I can't ignore. That would be certainly a place I'm looking for, and I think at some point this rotation out of mega cap tech comes back, and these names start to help lead the markets higher again.
You just mentioned your small cap analysis last night. You went through a little bit of a history. What is similar at this point in history to other times that we've seen small caps perform like this?
Small caps can have it's so interesting because to see the small caps make such a big move into 52-week highs, it's actually kind of, it's sort of rare, at least when I was looking through the data last night. A lot of the big moves actually came after large declines. And so it just kind of, I think, speaks to the sort of, even though we have decades and decades of history to parse through, it sort of speaks to the uniqueness of the moment. And that doesn't apply just to small caps, but can apply really to any asset. It's when you look back in time, things tend to rhyme, but they don't tend to repeat. And so I think that's sort of an interesting dynamic about markets that always kind of keeps investors on their toes.
Is there a crypto opportunity that you think people are maybe not talking enough about?
For me, I like to go back to Bitcoin. It's the largest the largest cryptocurrency out there. It's the most well known. Investors have more access to it now than they've ever had before with the introduction of ETFs earlier this year. The political climate is starting to warm up to it. It's got a lot of the right catalysts, and even a lot of investors view it, I think, in the, quote unquote, the right way. They have a long-term view. They have a big picture vision for it. And that type of stuff tends to bode well for an asset over time. And, again, we go back to this consolidation that Bitcoin's in, and, it hasn't really been doing a whole lot, but again, that's healthy price action. When I look at Bitcoin and I think of it from a, bigger picture perspective, I see a lot of positives lining up for it. Doesn't mean it's gonna, erupt in the immediate term future, or, I can't predict when it will rally, but the positives are starting to pile up for this name.
You mentioned the elections there. A lot of folks are watching the elections as the next catalyst for Bitcoin, maybe even Ether, crypto markets in general. Are you surprised that this narrative has developed over the last couple of months?
Yeah, I kind of am. We've seen the SEC warm up to crypto by giving the green light to bring ETFs to market for both Bitcoin and Ethereum. Now we're hearing both presidential candidates speaking, much more warmly and accepting of crypto than we saw, go back the last several elections, or even just going back speaking largely in terms of regulation. The climate's warming up for this group, and we obviously want investors to have certain protections in place, but we also want investors to have access to these investments. And that seems to be the direction we're headed in. And it's obviously we still need to get some things done, but the way we're moving it's in the right direction.
I have to tell you, Kevin O'Leary joined Markets Daily probably about a week ago now, and he said he's not a fan of the ETFs. Why would he put his money into the ETFs if he can just hold Bitcoin or Ether? Curious to get your thoughts on that. Maybe you can outline from a more analytical perspective, more technical perspective. What are the benefits for investors in the ETFs versus holding their own tokens in their own wallet?
Yeah, that's a great point, and there are pros and cons to be made, for each side of it, for owning the actual the underlying and owning the ETF. And I would just say, from eToro's perspective, we've offered cryptocurrency for a long time, and we do now offer the ETFs on our platform as well. And we see investors partake in both sides, and I think if we zoomed out, largely speaking to just all investors, some investors cryptocurrencies are still they're a new asset class, especially for a lot of investors. I think of my parents or my aunts and my uncles, and having to sort of help describe what it is. And I think when you look at a lot of traditional investors, they're not familiar with cryptos, but they're familiar with ETFs, or they have a traditional brokerage account, but not one that has access to cryptocurrencies. And so I think when you sort of blend some of those traditional finance vehicles with the new assets of today, it kind of bridges that gap a little bit and just helps create a little bit more familiarity, and helps sort of bolster the recognition, I think, that comes with traditional investing vehicles.
And just before we wrap up here, what are you watching heading into the end of the year?
You know, the stock markets have done really, really well this year. Small caps have come back to life, but largely speaking, it's been driven by the S&P and by the Nasdaq. We've seen really strong price performance in crypto, especially through the first 3 or 4 months of the year. I'd like to see how do the markets approach the election? How do we kind of get through Q3, which historically tends to be a little volatile, especially when we start getting into the August and September months. We can really see some moves. So I want to see how we get through Q3, how we navigate the election, and then, can we finish on a strong note? Can we finish on a high? See that rotation back into tech. See small caps continue to participate in the rally now that they're finally here, and see if Bitcoin can't make a new high this year. That'd be really exciting.
I got to ask you about crypto equities since you just brought up some tech stocks there. We have equities like Coinbase, MicroStrategy, very much tied to the price of crypto. Any crypto related equities that you're watching that are performing in an interesting way to you?
Those names are always going to be tied to Bitcoin, they deserve to be. So as goes Bitcoin, as goes those names. I personally, I prefer to go straight to the source. I like to go right to Bitcoin, or right to crypto, to see what's really driving the force behind those names.
Bret, thanks so much for joining the show this morning. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you to our audience for listening and coming on this journey with me to better understand the crypto markets. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the CoinDesk Podcast Network, available on all podcast platforms, and give us a 5-star review. If you prefer to watch video, you can find us on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button and like this video. Your support means the world to us. We hope you have a fantastic day, and we'll see you tomorrow.